Welcome back to Composition and its Allies. My name is Barney. I'm a classical composer, and this is a channel for composers as well as performers interested in composition. In today's episode of Orchestration for Beginners, I'm going to show you the before and after of my first orchestral work and what I did to improve it. Let's begin. So this is the first version that I composed in America before I moved to France and got proper training in harmony as well as orchestration classes. So let's look at contrast between sections. We'll look at a transition zone. So notice that we have 3 groups, and then we go to 2 groups. We have the before, so woodwinds, brass, and strings, and then afterwards, woodwinds, strings, plus piano. Now, one thing to mention about overly generous orchestration competitions. You may try to submit your first orchestral work into a competition that says you can have cor anglais, you can have harp, and all these, extra additions, but there are a couple of problems with this. First and foremost, you may not win the competition. This is not because you don't have a good work, but unfortunately, some competitions are looking for a specific applicant, and they're not overtly advertising who they're looking for. That's all I'll say in the matter. Another thing to think about is, let's say you just don't win the competition because they found someone better. Even if you still have a good piece, how are you going to get it performed if you have this extra expense associated with it? So, as much as possible, just restrain yourself and just use a conventional orchestration for your first orchestral work. Now, looking in terms of groups, I emphasize a lot on this channel. It's definitely a very French method. You think about the strings, the woodwinds. It's a great way to get started. Here, it feels a little bit superficial because of the number of instruments being utilized and how they're being utilized. I would say we're going from a 2D sound to a chamber sound. So we have strings, we have 2 French horns, we have 2 bassoons, we have an oboe, we have verses, bassoon, cello, and the piano. In terms of contrast, we go from a higher texture to a lower texture, which would have been compositional first and foremost. And notice that we have a string-dominant sound with some brassy, reedy qualities and to a lighter sound. So I would say this is actually, from a sense of contrast, is quite nice. Now, let's talk about a common orchestration mistake. A common orchestration mistake is lack of precision. I hesitate to mention it on this channel because it's one of those things I think a lot of people think they know, but do you really know? Can you verify right now that it's not the case for you in your first orchestral work? So notice that we have bassoon, okay, and we don't know how many bassoons are playing, right? Afterwards, we see a second bassoon coming in, and then prior, it says "à deux." So my assumption is that this first entrance here is the second bassoon, and afterwards, of course, it would be the first bassoon. Now, obviously, I was able to figure it out rather quickly, but you do not want the conductor having to spend that time on confusion. Probably won't even have the time to even get on that level. You don't want confusion in your first orchestral work. Now, a bigger issue besides the fact that this is like a spelling mistake, oh, it's just a tiny mistake. I get it. But the bigger issue is if there are multiple instances of this in your first orchestral work, it is probably indicative that there are larger problems related to a lack of attention to detail that are present in your first orchestral work. Let's talk about over-orchestration. So this is definitely a common problem for first-time orchestrators. I think it comes from a number of reasons. One, you're super excited. You have the big symphonic sound, you have all these great masterworks in your head, and you just want to really, get that orchestra effect. But of course, with orchestration, a lot of times less is more. Another thing is maybe we feel insecure. We're not sure how many instruments that we need. And this, of course, can be addressed through harmony in terms of doublings. But as a consequence, we just have too many instruments, or we have too many instruments too much of the time because we're not thinking across sections. French, we call that pêle-mêle orchestration. It's kind of random. You're here, you're there, and all over the place, okay? Now, let's look at measure 20 to 24. Notice we have strings and woodwinds all in the melody, and it's a piano volume. Okay. Is this really necessary? We have 3 separate string parts, and we have 4 separate woodwind parts. The clarinets are at the unison. This is a lot, okay? And again, maybe, in French we say ça passe, okay? It can work here, but is this happening throughout your first orchestral work? It probably is, if you're seeing it this early, okay? Another thing you want to think about is musical conversation, which would be reflected in the orchestration. So notice in measure 25 to 27, a new melody comes in and it's in a higher register. So probably you would want this to come in a new instrument or in a new group. Okay, so some quick fixes that you would think about are maybe having the strings first and then the woodwinds come in on a response, or having the woodwinds first and then the strings come in on the response. Of course, there's other things you have to factor in, the contrast between the adjacent sections and, the balance, all these other things. But that is an idea that already I think is going to lead to a fresher orchestration, especially if throughout your entire piece you have this awareness in your mind. Though sometimes you just got to get the piece done, get the performance, and then you make the changes, okay? I think having both of them at the same time here, especially if it's many different moments throughout this work, which it is, the consequence is going to be a dull orchestration. Don't worry, in part 2, I will show you what I did to fix it, okay? Now, it also depends on length of time. For example, think of a Shostakovich symphony, which in my opinion, some of them are a bit too long. Think about these long passages, which are just the strings. He doesn't have to bring in the woodwinds to sustain our attention. So it's not always about just changing instruments to reflect a change in melody, okay? Now let's talk about voice leading. So notice that the strings are at 4 voices, so the woodwinds should probably be at 4 voices too, okay? So notice that the flutes are on 2 separate notes, and we have 2 clarinets at the unison. In terms of blend, I think this can sound really nice. We have the flutes in their low register and clarinets in the low medium register, so they're going to work really well together. However, the voice leading is unclear. So if we look at this piano reduction I did, notice that the true bottom line is that D, C sharp, B. But the clarinets on their bottom line are doing doing F sharp, E, B. So the last note, they switch to the bottom of the chord. Now, certainly when you orchestrate, especially for a large tutti passage, you will have voice parts that switch parts of the chord, okay? That definitely is going to happen, especially if you're going out of range, okay? But it feels a bit strange here, okay? Now, if you remember a video I recently did on the essential rule for orchestration, I showed you how I had a melody, 3-note chord, and I put the top melody in the oboe and the bottom 2 partials in the clarinet. That was to bring out the oboe. So let's say you want to bring out the melody, maybe you would put it at the unison, but that would be the top of the chord. You also might double the bass. Here we don't really have bass, it's the lowest note, but it doesn't function as a bass, but you might put it at the unison or down the octave to bring that out. But here it's doing like this middle part and switching, and they're both on the same part, so it's drawing unnecessary attention to a part that doesn't need that kind of attention. In terms of solution, notice what I proposed. So having 2 clarinets on 2 separate voices for the first note, which is a 4-note chord. Then when the texture switches to 3 notes, I have the clarinet 1 at the unison with the flute 2. This is a common solution I've been talking a lot lately on this channel. When you have 3-note chords in the woodwinds, you probably will have to do that, or you'll have to expand the chord and have other partials of the chord. One quick note is note the intervals in the flute. The flute is a bit exposed because it's top of the register and it's on these fourths. Again, it's not horrible, it's not bad, but is this what you really want? Let's talk about the accompaniment. So we have triplets in the cellos and violas, so that works well. We have triplets and trumpets and horns. This is a problem, okay? It's not practical writing. It's going to be very, very distracting for the listener, okay? The brass are going to suck up all the attention, and they're not really the melody. There's also a huge risk of cracks in the sound, so you got to think about the brass players. Let's say your piece is last on the program for the world premiere. If the brass are épuisés, as we say in French, if they're kind of exhausted from very adventurous writing in other pieces, when they get to your piece, their chops are not going to be in full opulence, so there's a risk that there'll be cracks in the sound. Another thing to think about is this is not standard orchestral writing, okay? For the brass, when you do arpeggio, by the way, I'm speaking as a tubist, a lot of times the valve fingering is the same. So the way you get the different partials is going to be lipping up. So it's definitely, you have to really hear the notes you want to get to. So it's just not super accurate. When you're composing for the orchestra, your music needs to be sight readable, okay? So you cannot expect that orchestral musicians are going to have time to practice your music or will practice your music. You will find a few youth orchestras, the conductor will say, okay, everyone go home and practice your music. No one's going to practice your music, okay? When people go home, they have other things to do, or they're going to work on their chamber pieces in which their part is more exposed, or recital music in which they're definitely exposed. They're not going to practice the music, okay? Now, if you're writing for brass quintet or brass ensemble, that's different. They will probably want more adventurous writing. Let's talk about the chords. So notice the instruments that we have present. So we have all three groups. We have flutes, oboes, clarinets, woodwinds. We have trumpets, which is the brass. We have the violins, which is the strings. Is this really necessary? In particular, because it is a piano texture. Let's look section by section, which is the French perspective. Okay, so woodwinds. Flute and oboe sound nice together. Okay, they're in four separate notes. Notice the oboe is below the flute, but it's at a register where it's not going to be dominate too much in terms of its timbre. So I think it works well. Notice that they're moving in parallel motion. Be careful of composers that you can't have. No. Okay, so parallel fifths is something you don't have in harmony because it's a specific study, but this is composition. Orchestration is composition. Okay, so if you have parallel fifths, that's what you're hearing, that's what you have. Okay. Now, in terms of the clarinet, my question here is what is the clarinet adding? So notice it's on one of the oboe notes and one of the flute notes. What is the reason for this? Certainly a large tutti passage, you're going to have doublings and stuff like that, so it would make sense, but here they're not really adding anything. Then we look at the trumpet. Notice the trumpet is doubling the oboes. Is this really necessary, right? It's not a loud passage. Why does this have to be? Now, in terms of overpowering the oboes, I don't think there's that big of a risk because oboes get stronger the lower they get towards the bottom of the staff, and it is piano, though I do think the timbre of the trumpet is going to kind of draw our attention a little bit away from the oboes, though they are the bottom of the chord. Now, in terms of the flutes, we have a huge problem. Okay, flutes are in a medium register. They're just around the top of the staff. They're not going to have a lot of projection power, so placing the trumpets this close is not possible. Okay, notice that the upper trumpet and the flute too are only a third apart. So definitely the trumpet, just in terms of timbre, not even mentioned in terms of volume, it's going to suck up our attention because it gets brighter as it gets to the top, which the flute has a paler sound. Okay. Now, if you're feeling discouraged in terms of, wow, there's so many decisions I have to make for orchestration, there's so many things to think about, well, it is just, you have to get over it. It's part of your job, right? You're the king or queen of a kingdom, okay? There's so many things you have to think about, larger details, smaller details, and ultimately, you're just going to have to power through. You have to make it happen. You have to get that performance. Now, some things that are indispensable. I think the best solution to like existential problems with orchestration is to address it at the source, which is harmony. It's a long-term solution, but obviously we see a lot of doublings, unisons, which partials of the chord. We haven't talked much about the amplitudes today, but that's another thing. And this is all mastered in harmony studies. In fact, in France, you would have had 3 to 5 years of weekly harmony classes or lessons before doing orchestration in most cases, okay? Now, I think the French method to learning orchestration is really, really helpful, though not necessarily indispensable. So you get training on a regular basis. You're going to weekly meet with your professor, and you are assigned an excerpt from piano sonata, okay, so Mozart, Beethoven, Debussy maybe, and then you have to orchestrate it, and then you're going to get feedback. So on the screen here is an example of some work I did when I was in France. I had 3 years of orchestration classes and 5 years of harmony. So I have Debussy's Feuilles Mortes, okay, which translates to dead leaves. And I need to orchestrate it. So some of the things I'm thinking about, like that pedal bass line, what instrument is it going to go to? Probably the double bass. Are they going to be pizzicato? Okay, do I need to double the bass more because it's only one instrument? Then when we look at the chords in the piano, notice that F sharp to E in the right hand is also replicated in the left hand. So probably that's the true melody. Maybe I'm going to put it in a different instrument. Look at those block chords. So that's a lot of notes that presumably is a different instrument. So it's pianissimo. How am I going to get pianissimo with that many different instruments? Okay, these are just legitimate things you have to think about. Then let's look at what I submitted for my homework. So notice that I have the flute and the cor anglais in octaves for the opening melody, and then I have the response coming in the clarinet and the bassoon. My teacher mentioned that it probably would be better to have the response coming in the strings. Okay, cool. And then notice at the bottom, there is some issue with the unisons or doublings between the double bass and cello. So obviously just one class isn't going to be a quick fix, but on a regular basis, getting these kind of corrections and then implementing it, it's going to, when you proceed to orchestrate, you'll find it much easier. But of course, it's always going to be difficult, and sometimes you just have to power through and make it happen. You can't stop what you're doing and start a new study, okay? I'd like to show you the revisions I did after my training in France, but first I want to address another important thing. Notice that the violins are the bottom of the chord, so they're not doing the entire chord, just that third at the bottom. This is giving a lot of melodic importance because we think there's multiple players, okay? So the listener is getting sucked to the bottom of the chord. Also notice that there's a lot of other instruments on that bottom of the chord, G to B. So maybe my actual intention in this younger version of myself was to bring out that bottom of the chord, but it does raise some doubts. Now, let's talk about an orchestration competition here at Composition and its Allies. If you're currently orchestrating and you want feedback, much like you would see just in this video in general for your first orchestral work, you can submit it to our first ever orchestration competition. The deadline is coming fast, so just make sure that you commit sooner rather than later because you don't want to do something that's like not your best work. And information can be found directly on my website, barneyjmusic.com/orchestration. Now I'd like to show you the revisions that I made for my first orchestral work. So just as a reminder, I composed it first in America, and then I moved to France to get training in harmony. So let's look at contrast between sections. So we go from 10 instruments to 4 instruments. We have the violin 1, the violin 2, the viola, the cello, 2 oboes, 2 clarinets, 2 bassoons, and then we switch to violin 1, violin 2, viola, cello, concertinos with mutes. So boom, instant contrast. In terms of timbre, notice we have lots of string instruments and some prominent woodwinds. The lower oboes are going to stick out in that texture. The high clarinet definitely is going to stick out. And then we switch to cellos and muted strings. So there is an immediate sense of contrast, even if cellos were present prior. Let's look at strategy. So most likely, I orchestrated the second part first, figured out what's the minimum I need. I want a light texture. And then I orchestrated what was prior. So probably when you're orchestrating and you have these contrasting sections, if at all possible, you want to set up your orchestration paper, your handwritten paper, so that it's all on one page instead of crossing over to different pages, because you don't want the mechanics of a page turn preventing you from setting up really good orchestration that makes sense across. In terms of accompaniment, notice measure 20 to 23. It's simpler. I have just the cellos, just simple, simpler. Less is more in orchestration, okay? Be careful of l'orchestration surchargée, as I talked about prior, where you just have too many instruments too much of the time. You may feel like, oh, but I want this. But what if you want it here, you want it there, you want it everywhere? You're going to have a dull orchestration. Less is more, usually. Measure 25 to 27. Notice I just took up the arpeggios of the brass. Thank goodness, okay? I honestly don't know, as a tubist, why I wasn't able to see that this was not something good in the first version, but so be it. I took them out and noticed that I have it in cellos and violas. Now, I actually think orchestrationally, the cellos and violas would have been sufficient with the woodwinds, but notice I have them doubled with the bassoon. So probably what it means is I was hearing this kind of melodic roll to the accompaniment where it's kind of like shifting and it's just very active. Let's look at the melody. So the melody is just chords, okay, but still melody, right? And notice I have one group at a time. I have the strings, and then I switch to the woodwinds. So where is this coming from? Well, remember I showed you in the first part that work I did in orchestration class where the teacher was pointing out, thinking about that musical conversation. Doing that, on a regular basis over several years, it became very natural when I revised my orchestra work to just think about just simple ways to get that musical conversation. If you want feedback on your first orchestral work, don't forget our competition. Make sure to submit on time and make sure to check off on the equality and fairness box. If you want to learn more about how the French learn orchestration in terms of orchestrating piano scores, then check out the short series I have called How the French Learn Orchestration. Thank you for watching and have a good day.